Before we get started with actually creating something in 3D Studio, we should talk briefly about working with the file types that 3D Studio uses, how to import, export files, and most importantly of all, how to set up projects and also archive the scenes that you're working on. The default format that 3D Studio uses these days is the Max format here, and you should be able to recognize that just from the Max extension and also from the icon that you get. So be on the lookout for these. These are your main scene files, and this is the native format for 3D Studio. Let's bring up 3D Studio then, and the first thing you should do when working on any 3D project is actually set up a project. It's not the same as working in, say, Photoshop, where you just work with a single file. When you work on a 3D project, most applications such as 3D Studio and Maya will actually set up an entire folder structure or a project folder. And so you'll save your 3D objects to one folder, typically the scenes folder. The texture maps that get assigned to those objects will get saved in a different folder. Any renders that you produce will get saved somewhere else, etc. So to create a new project, which is what you should do when you first start anything new, just click on the application button, go down to the manage option and click on set project folder. Now because I haven't actually created a project yet, what I'm actually going to do is create a new folder. So I'll just navigate to a temporary location where I'm going to store this folder, and I'll just give it a name, and I'll call it example project. I'll just pick up that folder that I've created and click OK. Now you might think that what it's done is just created an empty folder, but if I actually go to where I created that example project folder and move inside there, you'll see that it's actually populated it with all these default folders, and you can see, for example, we've got the scenes folder, which is where all of my files are going to get stored for this particular project. So it's essential to set up this hierarchy when you're creating any kind of new project and keep your files in the relevant project folder that you're working on. If I come back into Max then, you can see I've got an empty scene here, but if I wanted to I could just go to New and then New All to start a new scene. What I can now do that I've got my project set up is just click on Save As, and I can navigate to that folder that I created. Here's my project folder, and I'll go to the scenes folder and I'll give this file a name. So let's do example scene. You'll notice it's going to save with the Max extension, and click Save. That scene that I'm now working on belongs in the correct project folder, so do ensure that you're saving into the correct location. Now what happens if you want to start a new project? Well, what I would do is go back into Max, do the same thing again, manage and set project folder, and what I'll do now is create a new folder. I'll call it example project 02, and I could save this scene in the new project folder, example Max scene 02. Now because I've moved into that new project folder, I'm actually working out of a different location, so I've got two project folders set up. So if in a couple of weeks I come back and decide to work on example project 1, it's essential that within 3D Studio I actually go back down to the Manage tab and set the project folder back to example project. Be sure to set that project folder according to which project you're working on. Now often you'll be working on a project that requires you to import previously created assets from a different project or just a different file, and what this 3D Studio allows you to do is actually merge in previously created files, or specifically objects from within those files, into the current scene file that you're working on. Now all you need to do is go to the application menu and go down to the import option, and we want to select merge from this list, and I can bring in a file that I was previously working on and click open. And what this allows me to do is select the geometry from that file that I'd like to import, so you don't have to bring everything in. Once I've selected that, I can just click on OK, and you'll see that the object that I was working on previously has now come in. I can scale that up, and I've just been able to combine two files together, so you shouldn't feel like you have to start from scratch each time. Now, you shouldn't feel like you're restricted to only being able to import existing 3D Studio Max projects. What's really cool is that 3D Studio is fairly compatible with other existing applications, and one such example might be Adobe Illustrator. So I've got a previous logo that I created here in Illustrator, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to produce a 3D version of this. So what I might do is import this into 3D Studio as a series of vector curves. Now, one thing to note is that you should prepare this in a legacy format. So when I save it, I'm just going to overwrite this existing file. I'm not going to save it to the newest version. What I am going to do is I'm going to go step all the way back to Illustrator 8, which is an older format, and I'm going to save it in that older format. It's going to tell me that I might lose some of the new features, but that's okay. If I come back into 3D Studio, I'm going to pull this over so you can see the whole menu. Now when I go down to Import, instead of merging an existing 3D Studio file, I'm actually going to import, it says here, a non-native format. So you'll notice that because my project folder has been set, it's automatically gone to that import folder in that project. So I placed that softball AI file in that import folder because I knew it was going to go there. So I'll import that file, and you can see I've got options. I can merge it with the existing scene, which is empty anyway, or I can just completely recreate a new scene. Click on OK. You can bring it in as multiple objects or as a single object. I like to bring them in as multiple objects. I'll click OK. And now you can see that that softball logo that I created as a series of vectors in Illustrator is now viewable directly within 3D Studio Max. So what I could then do is I could start extruding these curves out, and I could then produce a 3D version of that logo. I could replace this with a sphere and start animating that. So you've got a lot of flexibility as to how you actually begin with inside 3D Studio. When working on a scene, it's quite likely that your 3D application is going to crash at some point. It happens often, and it can be for any number of reasons. Now, best case scenario, you can just load up that file again and you'll get the work as it was the last time you saved. Worst case scenario will be that the file has actually become corrupted. So best practices for working in 3D, or in fact any application, are to increment your saves. Now the easiest way to do this is to just add an additional number on the end and just keep incrementing that number. So I've got mushroom here. I could just add mushroom 01 and save that as the newest version, and I can always fall back to these previous increments that I saved prior to this one. Now another way to increment your saves is to just click on this little plus symbol here, and when I do that, you'll notice that at the top of my 3D Studio dialog, the file is now called mushroom01, so that just automatically increments that file. If I were to go File, Save As, and just click on that again, this will now become version 2, etc. So that's an easy way to increment your files and ensure that you don't, get into a sticky situation where you lose a lot of work. Another option that you can do is to back up your files automatically every time you save, so that if I save this file, what will happen is I'll save a BAK file or a backup file of the previous version of that file, just in case something goes wrong during the save. To check that this feature has been turned on then, what we can do is just go to the Application button and click on Options to bring up 3D Studio's preference settings. Click on Files, and you'll see that by default backup on save is in fact turned on. Now by default, if your project is set, this will actually save the backup directly into your project folder. So if I come to my mushroom project, you'll see this auto back folder. If I go inside that, you'll see this maxback.bak. So it's only incrementing one backup per save. You can see that the last time I saved this, it saved the previous version before it made those changes to the existing file. Now another option you have is to create these auto backup files. And you can see that these are stored with a Max extension. So if I come back into 3D Studio, go back into those preference settings again and files, you'll see that this is enabled by default, and it tells you how many backup files it's going to keep. So it'll keep a maximum of 3. So once it creates the third one, it'll then go and overwrite the first one, and so on. The interval is currently set to 5 minutes, and then the default file name is just auto backup. So if you forget to save, every 5 minutes 3D Studio is going to save your bacon, as it were. Now the problem is, when you're working on huge files, then they can take a little while to save, especially if you're working across a network. So it can be useful depending on the size of the project you're working on. You don't want to set this, saving too frequently, otherwise it's going to slow everything down. You also see this option compress on save. Now you might think smaller files are better, but if you're working across a network, that can speed things up because it's having to transfer less data, but it's going to have to spend time compressing the file. So I'd leave that turned off unless you really need it. Let's talk now about how you might share a project with somebody, or in particular an individual scene file that I'm working on. So say I'd like to share this mushroom file with somebody, and this belongs inside the mushroom project that I've created. Now you might think, well, I could just go into the scenes folder and share the max file of the actual object that I'm working on. Now if we go back into Max, the problem is you'll notice that I've applied some shaders and also some texture maps onto this object. Now these texture maps are going to be stored as part of the project, and they'll be stored under Scene Assets and Images. And you'll see 3 texture files here. You might think, well, I could just give the person the texture files and also the scene file. But the problem is they won't be stored in these folders anymore, so you'll have broken the file hierarchy of the project. So a much more efficient and easy way to share this file and all of its associated files such as texture maps, etc. with someone would be to archive the project. And this is simple. You just go up to the Application button, Save As, and you'll see this Archive option here. Now what it does is it actually creates a zip file of not just the 3ds file, but all of the associated texture files that belong with that project. So I'm going to save this to my scenes folder in the project, give it a name. You'll notice that the format's changed to zip. I can click Save, and a little DOS dialog box pops up, and what it's doing is it's compressing that project down. If I go inside my scenes folder now and look for that zip file that I created, you'll see that I've got a folder, I've got a TXT file, and also that original Max file that I was working on. So there's the Max file. Well, what's this TXT file explaining? Well, it's showing you all of the other files that have been included in this archive, in this case the texture files. If I navigate through this hierarchy of folders, you'll see that it's got that Scene Assets folder, the Images folder, and then those 3 texture maps that I associated with that 3D Studio file. So if the person on the other end were to extract all of the files from this zip, they'd be able to open up the Max file and all of the linked texture files would automatically load in. And I'd know that that person was seeing the file as I intended it to be seen, complete with all those texture files. So when sharing 3D Studio files, archiving is a great way to do that, to make sure that you don't leave anything behind.